The UK government created and now has partially privatised something they call the Behavioural Insights Team, which is colloquially called the Nudge Unit, as you can see here. This is something, an institution that they use in order to modify the behaviour of the general public in small but tangible ways. As you can see from their own words here, the Nudge Unit was established by David Cameron's government to apply behavioural science to public policy, and this is based on a book called Nudge by David Thaler, who identified that actually people are not the kind of Adam Smithian rational economic actors that we normally think that they are, and in fact respond to incentives in actually fairly habitual and unthinking ways. So if you give people a choice between two things, they will take the most beneficial and easiest choice most of the time. And so most people will be siphoned into the category you want them to be in, rather than choosing the thing that you don't want them to be in. And this, again, is just something they're just completely open about telling you. They're completely open about telling you. And they'll tell you that they've worked on a variety of things. In particular, the most recent thing that was very prevalent in public life was the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. The Nudge Unit was employed to get people to wear their masks, to get them to take vaccines, to get them to stay inside and to follow the rules, and to generally cooperate with the state. And so what we have is a state that looks rather cynically at its own citizenry and says, well, they're kind of predictable when you've got the mass of people and the amount of data that they can collect, and we can kind of just treat them as numbers. And when we want something to happen, well, we can just incentivize the majority to do this thing, and they will do it. And we don't have to put in any kind of draconian commands. We don't have to create new laws. We can just offer a series of incentives, and people will follow those incentives. And so the population can be easily controlled and steered in the event the government needs that to happen. And they've got a series of tools to do this. In fact, one of those tools is something called controlled spontaneity that we learned about fairly recently from the Middle East Eye. Now, this is not a source I would normally cite, but unsurprisingly, the existence of this blueprint has been kept rather under wraps by the British media. They aren't, for some reason, interested in discussing this. And I think it goes back to their sort of connection with the Nudge Unit and the various linkages between the British tabloid and mainstream media and the British government. Because not only do they all seem to fall in line and not really spend a lot of time trying to hold the government to account as the Fourth Estate ought, well, they actually seem to be directly involved in the regime of this country and how it ought to be run. This controlled spontaneity is, again, something that was founded under the David Cameron government and is designed primarily to deal with the response to terror attacks, because there is a kind of natural human response, and then there is a kind of harmonizing multicultural response. And the government, of course, wants the harmonizing multicultural response to isolate each individual event and say, well, that was just an isolated event on its own. There was nothing we could have done. And therefore, we're just going to have to not look back in anger, as it were. So I'm going to read from this for a bit, because this is just remarkable. So the British government is prepared for terrorist incidents by pre-planning social media campaigns which are designed to appear to be spontaneous public responses to attacks. Hashtags are carefully tested before attacks happen, Instagram images selected, and impromptu street posters are printed. In operations that contingency planners term controlled spontaneity, politicians' statements, vigils, and interfaith events, again, interfaith events, very interesting, how they know where this is coming from, right, are negotiated and planned in readiness for any terrorist attack. The campaigns have been deployed during every UK terrorist incident in recent years, including the London Bridge attack in June 2017 and the Finsbury Park mosque attack that took place 2 weeks later. Within hours of an incident, campaigns are swiftly organised, with I Heart posters designed and distributed according to the location of the attack. Plans also drawn up for people to hand out flowers at the scene of the crime in apparently unprompted gestures of love and support. The purpose of the operation, according to a number of people involved in their creation who spoke to the Middle East Eye, is to shape public responses, encouraging individuals to focus on empathy for the victims and a sense of unity with strangers rather than reacting with violence and anger. So just to interrupt there, the purpose of this from the government's point of view is to preserve the multicultural project. They do not want the British public thinking that there is an intransigent and intractable issue between two communities. They want to believe that the terrible events that go off here and there and everywhere that we constantly see on a daily basis, like mass stabbing attacks, Islamic terror attacks, various things like that. They want to isolate them and say, well, these are just random nut jobs that we couldn't have prevented or would have been very difficult to prevent. And so we just have to accept that this is part and parcel of modern life. This is just what happens. And we're all terribly sad. And we're just going to move on together with a stronger sense of community. Even though that hyper reality does not represent the real underlying reality, which is people grow wary and resentful of one another because the underlying issue that caused this attack to eventually take place it goes unresolved. And there's no catharsis in the punishment for the people who allowed that to happen. The failure of the institutions and the failure of the people around the terrorist. There's no accountability for anything. And so that one person presumably either is killed in the attack or goes to jail. And then we just say, right, okay, well then nothing needs to change. And then another one happens and another one happens. I mean, yesterday there was something like 4 mass stabbings in Britain. And this is like, look, this can't go on. And so this is just a containment mechanism that is not going to last forever. But anyway, let's carry on. So they were expecting terror attacks at the 2012 London Olympics, which didn't happen. But as I say, some strategies have been devised in 2011 when social media platforms were aiding communications between protesters during the Arab Spring, and riots were erupting in English towns and cities that summer. This was, again, a very ethnically driven series of riots, the London riots. One senior figure involved in that contingency planning told the Middle East Eye that riots absolutely terrified the British government, which I completely believe that they did, and that Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary and was, when this was written, Prime Minister, had been particularly shaken. Because what are they going to do? What are they going to do? Are they going to sit there and go, right, okay, so the entire project that began in 1997 and that we're living in the ruins of, it doesn't work. So what are our options here? Well, it would be something quite outside of the scope of what the current managerial paradigm is prepared to countenance. And so, okay, well, we're just going to have some sort of consistent measure to essentially manipulate the British population to accept that this is just the way things are and to make sure that they don't get out of control and do something that would be terrible, right? So, okay, well, rather than solve the problems at the root, we're just going to keep putting plasters and bandaging up the wounds, and hopefully we'll keep the population in line. That's their plan. So that's an atrocious plan that guarantees more people die in the future, by the way. But anyway, the measures were intended to corral the Princess Diana-esque grief, because this you may be too young to remember, but there was a media blitz of Princess Diana around her death to turn her into the people's princess. I never particularly bought into it, but a lot of people did. But anyway, this person candidly describes those measures as mind control. Although there was no terrorist attack at the 2012 Olympics, they've been deployed in every terror attack since then. So one veteran contingency planner said, "The point I noticed the change was the Olympics. The management of the secret, hidden emergency planning work behind the Olympics became the social control we would fall back on if we had any terrorist attack or if there were any disruption. This job has changed significantly from planning organic people responses to tragedy, being told we would like people to do that. How do we get them there?" And you can see this is where the nudge unit would arrive in the circumstances. And again, the nudge unit don't publicly profess that they are engaged with this, at least not to my knowledge. They might do somewhere else, I just haven't seen it. But I would be shocked, absolutely shocked, if they weren't involved, because what they do is so concurrent with what this is. So a lot of the British public's responses are spontaneous, of course, but a lot is shaped. The government doesn't want spontaneity, it wants controlled spontaneity. And so they go on to explain the methods of how this is done by holding up placards as hashtags. Um, After the Nottingham Arena attacks, getting the family to come out and condemn racism, which was just unbelievably gross. Like, now is just not the time, is it? Come on, it's the family of the victims that was to condemn racism. And but anyway, they give some other examples here. A media campaign was swiftly deployed after British and American aid workers were beheaded by Islamic State militants in 2014. This is the Union Jack hijab that The Sun had on their front page, which is just, I mean, vulgar, obviously. What are you doing? The use of hashtags, posters and vigils after the London Bridge attacks in 2017, which 8 people were murdered and 50 injured. Twitter, Facebook, and mainstream media campaign that were employed later that month, shortly after a man drove his van into a group of people outside a mosque in North London, killing 1 and injuring 10 others. Again, they're trying to keep a lid on the ethnic tensions that are building in Britain. They are trying to nudge people into thinking that, in fact, it was just one crazed lunatic and he doesn't represent anything and there's nothing else that could be done, and therefore it's to distract the public's attention away from the unresolved contradictions between communities. Again, I have to speak very, very carefully because I'm in the United Kingdom. And so you can carry on reading this at times. It's a very long article, but I think this gives us enough context to understand the response to the Southport massacre, because a lot of people have been looking at the government's response to the Southport massacre bewildered. It turns out that, in fact, it's Amazon that was the problem. Sorry, what are you talking about? Why is the media suddenly on the same page? From the Mirror, which is a left-wing working-class paper, to the Times, which is a right-wing elite paper, both have the same front page. Oh, well, he could get it off Amazon. It's like, yes, he can get it off Amazon, or he could, because he used a kitchen knife. He can go to any shop and buy a kitchen knife, because believe it or not, we actually need kitchen knives in the kitchen. The fact that there are implements that can be employed to hurt people is just a fact of life. You could use a baseball bat. Are we going to stop playing sport now? A cricket bat. You could use any kind of blunt implement, let alone any kind of sharp implement. I mean, a man was stabbed in a home invasion to death using a screwdriver. So now are we not able to buy screwdrivers off Amazon? Do I need 2 licenses, a digital ID, various other things to buy a knife off of Amazon because I need to cut some pork or something in the kitchen? What are we doing here? This is not about the fact that he could buy something off of Amazon. Amazon is a retailer. They have total disgrace. What, could he not just have gone into his own kitchen and got a knife? Are we saying the Rudicabanas don't have knives in their own kitchen? Would his dad not buy a knife, put it in a kitchen drawer, and then leave it there and not think about it? Could he not, if Amazon were like, no, sorry, you don't have 1,200 levels of ID, you can't buy this knife, he wouldn't go, oh, well, I guess I just can't go on this stabbing then. No, he'd go into his own kitchen and get one, wouldn't he? Or he'd get one from someone else's house or something. I don't know. He'd find a way of doing it. Like, he'd use a blunt instrument maybe. He'd do something else. Like, the access to knives, again, look at all of them. Amazon killer, Amazon killer. And of course, that means censorship. That means IDs. That means more state control. And it means not addressing the real root of the issue, which is, why did this guy, who had various anti-British and terrorist manuals, why was he in our country? Like, why is it that people who hate our country are in our country and are apparently free to just roam around and commit massacres? These are the questions that the Multicultural Project will not answer. They can't answer them, because ultimately the fundamental conclusion that one would have to draw is that maybe multiculturalism isn't actually very good for Britain. Maybe diversity isn't actually our strength, and actually it needs constant propaganda reinforcement and elaborate government mechanisms to manipulate the public to be able to exist. And in fact, no one asked for this, and it doesn't really seem to be in our best interests. These are various strands of thought that the British government just simply does not have the cojones to pony up an answer. It's just no, not touching that. That's a big issue that can be very easily mishandled. And what we would rather do is just sit there with our fingers crossed, hoping that today someone doesn't murder a bunch of children. right? And when they do, we'll deploy the nudge unit, we'll deploy the controlled spontaneity doctrines, we will flood the media with anti-Amazon propaganda. We will say, right, okay, we need crackdowns, we need licenses, we need all of these things, and we will just get through this latest horror without having to change anything. Unbelievable. This is just, we live in an unbelievable country sometimes. But just be aware that this is what the government is doing to you right now. They are propagandizing you. They are nudging you in the directions that they want. And they're not going to stop doing this, by the way. This is the paradigm we are in, and we are going to be in for the foreseeable future.